high in the Colorado Rockies, where cell towers can't reach, and the nearest neighbor is 30 miles away, the Blackwood cabin sits like a fortress against the endless wilderness. 17-year-old Jake Morrison stumbles through the blinding snowstorm, his lips blue with cold, his worn boots barely holding together. He's been running for 3 days straight, not from the law but from the truth his dying grandfather whispered in that hospital room. When Jake pounds on the heavy wooden door, he expects rejection. Mountain folk don't trust strangers. Instead, identical twins Emma and Sarah Blackwood welcome him with warm smiles and hot soup. But as the storm rages outside, Jake notices things that don't add up. Photos on the mantel show faces he recognizes, old letters bear his family name, and the sisters keep exchanging glances when they think he's not looking. The boy who came seeking shelter is about to discover he's found something else entirely, answers to questions he never knew to ask. But some family secrets are buried in these mountains for a reason. The door swings open before Jake can knock a second time. 2 women stand in the warm glow of firelight, so identical he blinks hard to make sure the cold hasn't made him see double. Auburn hair frames heart-shaped faces, and green eyes study him with an intensity that makes his skin prickle. "Please," he manages through chattering teeth. "I just need—" "Come in, Jake Morrison." The woman on the left steps aside. Her voice carries the soft mountain accent he knows so well, but there's something else underneath it, something careful. His blood turns colder than the storm outside. "How do you know my name?" "Emma, get the boy some dry clothes." The second woman ignores his question, ushering him inside with gentle but firm hands. "I'm Sarah, you're half frozen." The cabin's warmth hits him like a wall. Pine logs crackle in a stone fireplace large enough to stand in. Hand-carved furniture fills the spacious room, and the smell of stew makes his empty stomach clench with hunger. It's the kind of place his grandfather described from the old days, before the mining companies and developers changed everything. Emma returns with thick wool clothes. "Bathrooms through there. These should fit." Jake wants to ask how they have men's clothes that look exactly his size, but exhaustion weighs down his questions. In the small bathroom, he catches his reflection in an antique mirror. 3 days of running have left him gaunt and hollow-eyed. His dark hair, so much like his grandfather's, hangs in frozen clumps. When he emerges, a bowl of venison stew waits on the rough-hewn table. The sisters sit across from him, hands folded, watching him eat with an attention that makes him squirm. "Bad storm to be traveling in," Sarah says. Jake nods, spooning the rich broth. "Got caught in it. Been walking since my truck broke down." "Long way from town," Emma observes. "What brings you up this high?" The question he's been dreading. Jake's eyes drift to the mantelpiece while he formulates an answer, and his spoon clatters against the bowl. Among the photographs of the sisters and various mountain scenes, one frame holds a picture that steals his breath. A young man in military fatigues grins at the camera, and Jake knows that face. He's seen it in his grandfather's albums. The man's uniform reads Morrison T, the same as his grandfather's war photos. "That's Thomas Morrison," Jake whispers, standing so fast his chair scrapes against the floor. The sisters exchange a look, quick but loaded with meaning. "You knew him," Jake says. "It's not a question." Emma's composure cracks slightly. "Sit down, Jake. Finish your food." "How did you know my grandfather?" The words tumble out. "Why do you have his picture? How did you know I was coming?" "We didn't know you were coming," Sarah says quietly, "but we've been hoping you would, for a very long time." Jake backs toward the door, his heart hammering. "This is crazy. You're strangers. I've never seen you before in my life." "Haven't you?" Emma rises, moving with fluid grace. "Look closer, Jake. Think about your grandfather's stories, the ones about the mountain people who helped him after the war." The wind howls outside, rattling windows and making the firelight dance. Jake's hand finds the door handle, but something in Emma's voice stops him from turning it. "He told you about us, didn't he?" Sarah joins her sister. "Maybe not directly, maybe in riddles and half-finished stories, but Thomas was never good at keeping secrets from family." "What secrets?" Jake's voice comes out as a rasp. The twins stand side by side now, mirror images of each other, their green eyes reflecting the firelight like a cat's. "The secret of why you can find places others can't," Emma says. "Why you feel the mountains calling you. Why you knew to come here when everything fell apart." Jake's grandfather's last words echo in his memory. "Find the sisters, boy. They'll tell you what I couldn't." The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a crystalline world where every pine needle wore a coat of ice that caught the early light like scattered diamonds. Caleb woke to the sound of wood being split outside, the rhythmic thunk of an axe biting deep into seasoned timber. He lay still for a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, the hand-hewn beams overhead, the faded quilt that smelled of lavender and cedar, the blessed absence of wind howling through gaps in poorly chinked walls. Through the frosted window, he could see one of the sisters working methodically through a pile of logs, her movements efficient and practiced. In daylight, he could tell them apart more easily. This one, Iris, he thought, wore her dark hair in a practical braid and moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had never known any world beyond these mountains. Her sister emerged from what looked like a root cellar, carrying an armload of preserving jars that gleamed amber and ruby in the morning sun. The cabin itself was a revelation. What had seemed like simple refuge in the darkness revealed layers of careful craft in the light. Hand-carved furniture bore the patina of generations of use. Shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound books, ceramic jars labeled in spidery script, and curious objects he couldn't identify. Polished stones arranged in precise patterns, bundles of dried herbs suspended from hooks, and what appeared to be star charts marked with notations in multiple hands. "You're awake." Rose had entered so quietly he hadn't heard her. She carried a steaming cup that filled the room with the scent of pine and something sweeter, honey maybe or maple. "Drink this. It'll help with the congestion in your chest." Caleb accepted the cup gratefully, though he eyed the dark liquid with some wariness. "What's in it?" "Nothing that will harm you." Rose settled into a chair beside the bed, her pale hands folded in her lap. White pine bark, elderflower, a touch of wild honey, our grandmother's recipe. The tea was surprisingly pleasant, warming him from the inside out. As he drank, he studied Rose's face, noting the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of someone who spent considerable time outdoors, despite her delicate appearance. "How long have you lived here?" "All our lives. Our family has held this land for, well, a very long time." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "What about you? Where is your family?" The question hit harder than he'd expected. Caleb stared into the dregs of his tea, seeing his father's weathered face, his mother's work-worn hands. "Down in the valley. My pa works the Hendricks mine when there's work to be had. Ma takes in washing." He set the cup aside. "They're good people, honest people, but honest doesn't fill empty bellies when the mine shuts down for the winter. Is that why you were traveling in such weather? Looking for work?" Caleb nodded, though it wasn't the complete truth. He'd been running as much as seeking, running from the fights that had grown more frequent as desperation settled over their household like a suffocating blanket, running from the look in his mother's eyes when she thought no one was watching, running from his own sense of helplessness. Iris entered, stamping snow from her boots. "Storm brought down some trees across the old logging road," she announced. "Won't be passable for days, maybe weeks." "Then our guest will have to stay with us a while longer," Rose said, and Caleb caught something in her tone, not displeasure but anticipation, as if his presence had introduced some long-awaited variable into their carefully ordered lives. "I don't want to impose—" "Nonsense." Iris moved to warm her hands by the fire. "Winter up here is no time for traveling anyway. Besides, we could use the help. There's more work than two people can manage properly." As if to demonstrate, she gestured toward a corner where several broken pieces of furniture waited for repair and shelves that clearly needed reinforcement. But Caleb sensed there was more to their invitation than simple practicality. The sisters exchanged another of their wordless communications, and he felt again that sense of standing at the edge of something significant, like a traveler who had stumbled onto an unmarked path that might lead anywhere. "What kind of work do you do up here?" he asked. "Besides the usual farming and such." The sisters shared another look, longer this time. Finally, Rose spoke. "We're keepers, you might say, guardians of old knowledge. Our family has certain responsibilities." "What kind of responsibilities?" "The kind," Iris said quietly, "that require us to be very careful about who we trust." She studied his face intently. "Tell me, Caleb, do you dream?" The question was so unexpected that he almost laughed. "Everyone dreams." "No," Rose said softly. "Not everyone dreams the way some people do. Not everyone sees things that haven't happened yet, or remembers places they've never been." Caleb's blood turned to ice water. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world crystalline and hushed beneath fresh snow. Elias woke to the sound of quiet voices drifting from the main room, punctuated by the gentle clink of dishes. For a moment, he couldn't place where he was. The soft bed, the warmth, the absence of wind howling through gaps in makeshift walls. Then memory flooded back, the desperate flight down the mountain, the mysterious cabin, the twin sisters who had taken him in without question. He dressed quickly in his still damp clothes and emerged to find both women preparing breakfast. In daylight streaming through clean windows, he could see them more clearly. They moved with an eerie synchronization, one stirring porridge while the other sliced bread, as if they shared an invisible thread of communication. Their resemblance was striking. The same dark hair, the same pale skin, the same sharp cheekbones, yet subtle differences emerged upon closer inspection. The one who had first answered the door carried herself with quiet authority, while her sister seemed more watchful, more hesitant. "You're awake," said the first sister, glancing up with a slight smile. "I'm Clara, and this is my sister Rose. We never did get proper introductions last night." "Elias," he replied, his voice still rough from sleep. "Elias Thorne. And I can't thank you enough for—" "Sit," Rose interrupted softly, gesturing to a chair at the wooden table. "You need food more than thanks." As they shared the simple meal, Elias found himself studying the cabin with growing curiosity. The furnishings were well crafted but old, as if frozen in time from decades past. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that looked ancient and well-loved. Strange symbols were carved into the wooden beams overhead, not random scratches, but deliberate patterns that seemed almost familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen them before. "You're running from something?" Clara observed, breaking the comfortable silence. It wasn't a question. Elias nodded slowly. "My stepfather. He's not a good man. When my mother died last month, there was nothing left keeping me there." He paused, then added quietly, "I've been searching for something. Someone, actually. My real father." The sisters exchanged a quick glance, so brief he almost missed it. Rose set down her spoon with deliberate care. "What do you know about him?" "Almost nothing. My mother would never speak of him, except to say he left before I was born. But sometimes, when she thought I wasn't listening, I'd catch her mentioning a place called Ravenshollow." He looked up hopefully. "You wouldn't know it, would you?" This time the glance between the sisters lasted longer. Clara leaned back in her chair, studying his face with new intensity. "Ravenshollow is not a place most people know about," she said carefully. "What else did your mother tell you?" "She had a locket," Elias said, reaching into his shirt to pull out a tarnished silver chain. "She wore it every day until she died. There's an inscription inside, but I've never been able to make sense of it." He handed the locket to Clara, who opened it with trembling fingers. Rose moved closer, and both sisters stared at the tiny inscription etched into the metal. The color drained from Clara's face. "Where did you say you were from?" Rose whispered. "The settlement up on Crane's Ridge. Been there my whole life, near as I can tell." Elias watched their reactions with growing unease. "Why? What does it say?" Clara closed the locket with a sharp snap and handed it back to him. It's Latin, an old blessing, but her voice carried an odd strain, and she wouldn't meet his eyes. You're lying, Elias said, though not unkindly. I can see it in your faces. You know something about this, don't you? The sisters looked at each other for a long moment, conducting some silent conversation. Finally, Clara spoke. If we tell you what we know, your life will change forever. Some truths, once learned, cannot be unknown. My life already changed forever when my mother died, Elias replied firmly. Whatever you know about my father, about Ravenshollow, I need to hear it. Rose stood abruptly and walked to one of the bookshelves. She pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. This belonged to our grandmother, she said, returning to the table. She kept records of certain families, certain bloodlines. Our family has always been guardians of sorts, Clara added, keepers of old knowledge, old secrets. Elias felt his heart hammering against his ribs. What kind of secrets? Rose opened the journal and turned through several pages before stopping. She rotated it toward him, pointing to an entry written in faded ink. At the top of the page, in careful script, was a name that made his breath catch in his throat. Thomas Thorne, Ravenshollow, 1847. Your father, Clara said quietly, was not the man you think he was. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world outside crystalline and hushed. Elias woke on the small cot near the fireplace, disoriented by the unfamiliar comfort of clean blankets and the lingering scent of lavender. For a moment he forgot where he was, then the events of the previous night came flooding back. The twins were already awake, moving about the cabin with practiced synchronicity. Luna knelt by the hearth, coaxing flames to life, while Stella prepared what appeared to be breakfast at a wooden table worn smooth by years of use. They moved without speaking, as if connected by invisible threads of understanding. You're awake, Luna said without turning around. The observation wasn't startling in its accuracy. Elias was beginning to suspect these women noticed everything. Stella glanced up from her work, studying his face with those penetrating grey eyes. You look rested. That's good. You'll need your strength. For what? Elias sat up slowly, his ribs protesting the movement. For the journey we're going to take. Luna rose from the fireplace, brushing ash from her hands. There are things you need to see, things that will help you understand why you ended up here of all places. Elias accepted the bowl of porridge Stella offered, noting how her fingers briefly touched his, warm, steady, reassuring. I don't understand. I came here by accident. I was running from Marcus Thorne's men. Stella's voice was matter-of-fact. We know. The spoon slipped from Elias's fingers. How could you possibly? Eat, Luna interrupted gently. Then we'll show you. The porridge was rich with honey and dried berries, better than anything Elias had tasted in months as he ate the sisters prepared for their mysterious expedition. They gathered items from around the cabin, a leather journal, a brass compass, and something wrapped carefully in oiled cloth that they handled with particular reverence. Marcus Thorne, Stella said suddenly, watching Elias's reaction. Tell us what you know about him. Elias set down his bowl, his appetite suddenly gone. He owns half the mountain, controls the other half. My father owed him money, gambling debts that kept growing no matter how much we paid. When Pa died last winter, Thorne said, the debt passed to me. And you couldn't pay, Luna observed. I tried, worked myself near to death in his mines, but the interest kept climbing faster than I could earn. Then last week he made a different kind of offer. Elias's voice grew tight, said he'd forgive everything if I'd help him with some special work. The sisters exchanged a look heavy with meaning. What kind of work? Stella asked softly. Finding people, tracking them down for him. He said I had a gift for it, that I could sense things others couldn't. Elias laughed bitterly. When I refused, he decided to collect his debt another way. Been hunting me ever since. Luna moved to the window, peering out at the snow-covered landscape. He wasn't wrong, you know, about your gift. What gift? I'm nobody special, just a mountain boy with more problems than sense. How did you find our cabin? Stella challenged. In a blizzard? In terrain you'd never traveled before? Elias opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. How had he found them? He remembered the strange pulling sensation, the certainty that safety lay in one specific direction, despite the howling wind and blinding snow. I got lucky, he said finally. Luck. Luna turned from the window, her expression almost amused. Yes, that's one word for it. Stella unwrapped the oiled cloth, revealing an ornate silver locket tarnished with age. She held it out to Elias. Does this look familiar? The moment his eyes fell on the locket, something stirred deep in his memory, a flash of warmth, of safety, of gentle hands, and a voice humming a half-remembered melody. His hand moved involuntarily to his throat, where he'd worn a cord for as long as he could remember. The cord was still there, but the small object that had hung from it was gone, lost somewhere during his desperate flight through the mountains. I had something like it, smaller. My father said it belonged to my mother. Your father, Luna said carefully, told you she died when you were born. It wasn't a question. Somehow, they knew. Yes. Elias's voice came out as barely a whisper. Stella moved closer, the locket still extended. What if we told you that wasn't true? What if we told you she's alive and that Marcus Thorne has been looking for her for 23 years, the same number of years you've been alive? The cabin seemed to tilt around Elias. That's impossible. Is it? Luna joined her sister. Is it really so hard to believe that a man who would chase a boy through a blizzard over a debt might have other, darker motivations? Elias stared at the locket, his world fracturing around the edges. Everything he'd believed about his past, his family, his very identity suddenly felt as fragile as ice in spring. Show me, he whispered. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline morning that made the mountain peaks gleam like polished silver. Elias woke to the sound of gentle humming drifting from the kitchen, a melody so hauntingly beautiful it seemed to pull him from sleep like invisible fingers. He lay still for a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar comfort of clean sheets and the absence of gnawing hunger in his belly. Through the window, he could see Clara tending to a small garden behind the cabin, her movements graceful and deliberate as she gathered herbs into a wicker basket. The sight of her in daylight revealed details the flickering firelight had obscured, the way her dark hair caught auburn highlights in the sun, the careful precision with which she selected each plant. There was something almost ritualistic about her actions, as if she were performing a sacred ceremony rather than simple gardening. She's been up since dawn, Vera said softly from the doorway, making Elias start. He hadn't heard her approach. Clara believes the herbs are most potent when harvested with the morning dew still fresh upon them. Elias sat up, suddenly conscious of his borrowed clothes, a simple shirt and trousers that fit him better than they should have. These aren't yours, he said, gesturing to the garments. Something flickered across Vera's face, too quick to interpret. They belong to someone who no longer has need of them. You're welcome to keep them. She moved to the window, watching her sister with an expression that seemed equal parts affection and concern. Clara has been asking about your family name again. She's quite persistent when something captures her interest. There's not much to tell. Elias joined her at the window, noting how the twins shared the same elegant bone structure, the same way of tilting their heads when lost in thought. My pa died when I was young. Ma never talked much about his people, said they were from somewhere far north, beyond the high passes. And your mother's family? Gone. She was the last. The familiar ache of loss settled in his chest. Always felt like there was something she wasn't telling me, but I figured it was just grief making her distant. Vera was quiet for a long moment, her grey eyes studying his face with unsettling intensity. Sometimes the things we don't say carry more weight than the words we speak aloud. She turned from the window. Clara's preparing a special breakfast. She has something she wants to show you afterward. The meal was unlike anything Elias had ever tasted. Eggs scrambled with wild mushrooms that seemed to burst with earthy flavor, bread that was impossibly light and sweet, and a tea brewed from the herbs Clara had gathered. The twins ate little, instead watching him with a shared expression of nervous anticipation that made him increasingly uneasy. "You cook like this every day?" he asked, hoping to break the tension. Clara smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We don't often have guests to cook for." She exchanged a glance with Vera. "Elias, there's something we need to discuss with you. Something about why you found our cabin when so many others have passed by without ever seeing it. I don't understand." "This place," Vera began, then paused, choosing her words carefully. "It doesn't reveal itself to everyone. There are protections, old ones, that keep it hidden from most travelers." Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. What kind of protections? Clara reached across the table and touched his hand, her fingers cool against his skin. The kind that recognized blood. Family blood. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "We think you might be our brother." The words hit him like a physical blow. Elias pulled his hand back, his chair scraping against the wooden floor as he stood. "That's impossible. I told you, my family—" "Your father's family," Vera interrupted gently. "What was his name?" "Thomas. Thomas Reed." The name felt strange in his mouth, as if speaking it aloud in this place gave it new power. The twins exchanged another look, this one heavy with meaning. Clara rose and moved to an old wooden chest in the corner of the room, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the lid. From within, she withdrew a small leather-bound journal and a daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame. "Our brother," she said, holding up the photograph. "Thomas Reed. He left 20 years ago to make a new life in the valley below." Elias stared at the image, his world tilting sideways. The man in the photograph had his eyes, his stubborn jaw, his unruly dark hair. But more than physical resemblance, there was something indefinable that screamed kinship, a wildness around the edges that spoke of mountain blood and ancient secrets. "He promised to come back," Clara continued, her voice thick with old grief. "We waited, but—" "He never did," Elias finished, understanding flooding through him like ice water. The borrowed clothes that fit so well, the way the cabin had seemed to call to him through the storm, the inexplicable sense of homecoming he'd felt from the moment he crossed the threshold, it all suddenly made terrible, wonderful sense. He wasn't just a desperate mountain boy seeking shelter, he was coming home. The morning light filtered through the cabin's frost-etched windows, casting prismatic patterns across the rough-hewn floors. Elijah woke to the sound of hushed voices drifting from the kitchen, punctuated by the gentle clinking of ceramic against wood. His ribs still ached from his desperate flight through the mountains, but the pain had dulled to a manageable throb. He dressed quietly, pulling on the clean clothes Lydia had left folded beside his bed, clothes that fit him perfectly, though he couldn't remember mentioning his size. When he emerged from the small room, he found both sisters at the kitchen table, an array of old photographs spread between them like fallen leaves. "Good morning," Clara said without looking up, her fingers tracing the edge of a particularly worn photograph. "There's coffee on the stove." Elijah poured himself a cup, the bitter warmth cutting through the mountain chill that seemed to permeate everything at this altitude. As he approached the table, Lydia gathered several photographs protectively against her chest. "We've been talking," she said, her voice carrying the weight of a decision made in the dark hours before dawn. "About what you told us yesterday. About your family." Clara shot her sister a warning glance, but Lydia pressed on. "Show him the photograph, Clara. The one from the summer festival. Lydia, we agreed to help him. This is helping him." The tension between the sisters crackled like green wood in a fire. Elijah set down his cup carefully, sensing he stood at the threshold of something significant. Clara's hands trembled as she placed a black-and-white photograph on the table between them. The image showed a group of people at what appeared to be a town celebration, bunting hanging in the background, children in their Sunday best gathered around adults in formal poses. But it was one figure that made Elijah's breath catch in his throat. A man stood at the edge of the group, his arm around a young woman with flowers in her hair. The man's face was unmistakably familiar, the same strong jaw, the same deep-set eyes, the same unruly dark hair that Elijah saw every morning in his shaving mirror. "That's impossible," he whispered, picking up the photograph with unsteady hands. "This looks like my grandfather, but he's been dead for 15 years. 23 years, Clara corrected softly. The photograph was taken 24 years ago, the summer before everything changed. Lydia leaned forward, her eyes intense. "What did your family tell you about your grandfather's death?" "A hunting accident in these mountains. They said his body was never recovered because of a snowstorm that winter." Elijah's voice grew smaller as he spoke, the familiar story suddenly sounding hollow and rehearsed. The sisters exchanged another loaded glance. Clara stood abruptly, walking to the window that faced the mountain peaks. "Your grandfather didn't die in a hunting accident, Elijah. He died protecting a secret that certain people would kill to possess." "What secret?" Lydia reached across the table and touched his hand. Her skin was surprisingly warm. "Your family owns mineral rights to most of this mountain range. Rights that were purchased legally but quietly over several generations. Rights that include claims to deposits worth millions of dollars." The coffee cup slipped from Elijah's nerveless fingers, clattering against the table. "That's impossible. We have nothing. We've never had anything." "Because someone has been working very hard to make sure your family never learned the truth," Clara said from the window. "Someone who benefits from keeping those rights in legal limbo while they extract what they can through shell corporations and falsified environmental surveys." Elijah's mind reeled. The poverty that had defined his entire existence, his father's bitterness, his mother's resignation to their circumstances, all of it suddenly took on a different shape. "Who?" he asked. "The same people who forced you to run through a blizzard to reach our door," Lydia said. "The same people who made sure your grandfather's death was recorded as an accident before his body was properly identified." Clara returned to the table, carrying a wooden box that had seen better decades. She opened it carefully, revealing stacks of documents, more photographs, and what appeared to be official papers bearing government seals. "Your grandfather came to us before he died," she said. "He knew they were closing in on him, knew they would do whatever necessary to keep the truth buried. So he gave us everything, every deed, every survey, every piece of evidence that proves your family's legitimate claim to these mountains." Elijah stared at the contents of the box, his entire understanding of his life crumbling and reshaping itself. "Why didn't he tell my father? Why keep it secret?" "Because he hoped the danger would pass," Lydia said. "Because he thought he could protect his family by keeping them ignorant. Because he underestimated how far some people will go for money." The cabin fell silent except for the wind whistling through the eaves. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, each flake catching the morning light like fragments of a shattered mirror, beautiful and sharp enough to cut. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside wrapped in a crystalline silence that made even whispered conversations feel too loud. Eli sat cross-legged on the worn wooden floor, the leather-bound journal open before him like a map to territories he'd never imagined existed. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across pages filled with his mother's careful handwriting. "She wrote about you," he said, his voice barely audible. "Both of you." Luna and Stella exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. They sat on either side of him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from their bodies, yet far enough to give him space to process what he was reading. "What did she say?" Stella asked, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. Eli's finger traced a passage dated 17 years ago. She was scared, pregnant and scared, but not of being alone. He looked up at Luna. She was scared of him finding her, finding us. The words hung in the air like smoke. Luna's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Eli caught the way her hands clenched in her lap. "Marcus Blackwood," Luna said the name like it tasted bitter. Your father, you knew him? Everyone in these mountains knew Marcus Blackwood, Stella replied. He owned half the mining rights, had his fingers in every business deal, every political appointment. But that's not why we remember him. Eli turned the page, finding an entry that made his breath catch. His mother had written about a place called Raven's Hollow, about secrets buried deeper than any mine shaft, about 3 young women who had sworn to protect each other, no matter the cost. She mentions Raven's Hollow here, he said. Says it's where everything started and ended. Luna rose abruptly, moving to the window where the morning sun was beginning to paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Some places hold memories like scars, she said. Raven's Hollow is one of them. Stella reached over and gently turned several pages in the journal. Read this one, she said, pointing to an entry near the middle of the book. Eli read aloud, his voice growing stronger with each word. The twins tried to warn me about Marcus, but I thought I could change him. I thought love could soften the hardness in him. I was wrong, and by the time I realized it, I was carrying his child, and he had already shown me what he was capable of. Luna and Stella helped me escape, but I know he'll never stop looking. The Blackwood family doesn't let go of what they consider theirs. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken truths. Eli closed the journal and looked between the 2 sisters, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time since he'd arrived at their cabin. They weren't just offering him refuge from the storm. They were offering him pieces of a puzzle he'd been trying to solve his entire life. He killed her, didn't he? The words escaped before Eli could stop them. Luna turned from the window, her blue eyes reflecting a pain so deep it took his breath away. We don't know for certain. The official report said it was an accident, a fall while hiking, but your mother was too careful, too experienced in these mountains to just fall. She knew these trails better than anyone, Stella added. She could navigate them blindfolded. Eli felt something cold and hard settling in his chest. His foster father's words echoed in his memory. Your mother was a troubled woman who made poor choices, but the woman whose words filled this journal wasn't troubled. She was terrified of a man with enough power to make her disappear. Why didn't you come forward? Tell someone what you suspected? Luna laughed, but there was no humor in it. Tell who? Marcus Blackwood owned the sheriff, the coroner, half the county commissioners. We were 2 young women living alone in the mountains. Who would have believed us? Stella reached for Eli's hand, her touch gentle but firm. So we waited. We knew someday you'd find your way here, just like she said you would. She said that? In her last letter to us, Luna said, returning to sit beside them. She wrote that, if anything happened to her, you'd eventually come looking for the truth. She said the mountains would call you home. Eli felt tears burning behind his eyes. The mountains had called him. Through every failed foster placement, every night spent dreaming of peaks and valleys he'd never seen, every restless moment when he'd felt like a stranger in his own life. There's more, Stella said softly. Things the journal doesn't contain. Things we'll show you when you're ready. I'm ready now, Eli said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. Luna smiled for the first time since he'd arrived, and it transformed her entire face. Then we'll start with Raven's Hollow, but first you should eat something. The truth is always harder to swallow on an empty stomach. The storm had passed, leaving the morning air crisp and clean, but the atmosphere inside the cabin felt charged with electricity. Elara sat by the window, her fingers tracing patterns in the condensation on the glass, while Vera busied herself with preparing breakfast. Marcus could sense the weight of unspoken words hanging between them all. You said you'd tell me about my father, Marcus said, breaking the silence that had stretched through their meal. Elara's hand stilled on the glass. Yes, I did. She turned to face him, her expression grave. But first, you need to understand why we came to live here, away from everyone else. Vera set down her cup with deliberate care. Our family has always been different, Marcus. We see things others cannot. Like what happened yesterday, he said, remembering how Elara had seemed to know exactly when the storm would break. Among other things. Elara rose and walked to an old wooden chest tucked beneath the stairs. She lifted the lid and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. This belonged to our grandmother. She documented everything, every vision, every premonition, every glimpse into what was hidden from ordinary sight. Marcus watched as she returned to the table, setting the journal between them like an offering. "What does this have to do with my father?" "Everything," Vera said softly. "Because 22 years ago, our grandmother saw something that changed the course of several lives forever." Elara opened the journal, pages crackling as she turned to a specific entry. June 15th. "A young man would come to the mountain," she wrote, running from a terrible choice. He would be hurt, desperate, and carrying a burden that wasn't his to bear. The words sent a chill down Marcus's spine. 22 years ago would have been around the time he was born. She saw him arriving in the middle of the night, Vera continued, bleeding, terrified, clutching something precious to his chest. "My father? Thomas Whitmore," Elara confirmed, though that wasn't the name he gave when he knocked on our door. Marcus felt the world tilt slightly. He'd never known his father's last name. His mother had always deflected his questions, claiming she couldn't remember or that it didn't matter. "Whitmore? He was running from the Blackwood family," Vera said, and Marcus's blood turned to ice. "The Blackwoods? But my mother always said they were dangerous, that we had to stay away from them." The sisters exchanged a meaningful look. "Your mother was right to fear them," Elara said, "but not for the reasons you might think." She turned several more pages in the journal, revealing a newspaper clipping tucked between the entries. The headline made Marcus's stomach drop: "Blackwood heir missing after family dispute." Thomas Whitmore worked for the Blackwood family, Vera explained. He was their accountant, trusted with their financial secrets. But he discovered something that horrified him: evidence of illegal activities that went back generations. What kind of activities? Land fraud, primarily. The Blackwoods had been systematically stealing property from mountain families for decades, forging documents, bribing officials. Your father found records proving that dozens of families had been cheated out of their ancestral homes. Marcus stared at the newspaper clipping. The missing Blackwood heir was a young woman named Catherine. What happened to her? "She was Thomas's ally," Elara said. "She'd grown up knowing her family's business was corrupt, but she didn't realize the extent until Thomas showed her the evidence. Together, they planned to expose everything. But the family discovered their plan," Vera continued. "There was a confrontation. Catherine disappeared that night, and Thomas barely escaped with his life. And with something else." "What?" Elara reached into the journal again and withdrew a small brass key, the key to a safety deposit box containing copies of all the evidence they'd gathered. "Thomas hid it here before he left the mountain." Marcus's hands trembled as he stared at the key. "He left it with you?" "Our grandmother helped him disappear," Vera said. "She used her abilities to guide him to a place where the Blackwoods couldn't find him, but she knew he'd have to come back someday, or send someone he trusted." "He never came back," Marcus whispered. "We heard he died in a car accident 3 years later, but he'd left instructions. If anything happened to him, his son would eventually find his way here." The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was learning. His father hadn't been just anyone. He'd been a man trying to right terrible wrongs, who died protecting evidence that could still matter. "The Blackwoods are still out there," Elara said quietly. "Still powerful, still corrupt. And if they knew you were Thomas's son, they'd try to stop me from using this," Marcus said, holding up the key. "Yes. But Marcus," Vera leaned forward, her eyes intense, "you have a choice. You could walk away, forget what you've learned, live quietly like your mother wanted. Or you could finish what your father started." The storm had passed, leaving the mountain air crisp and unnaturally quiet. Ethan stood at the cabin's small window, watching melting snow drip from the pine boughs like tears. Behind him, he could hear the soft rustle of papers as Maya and Clara prepared to reveal whatever truth had been weighing on their hearts for 3 days. Your mother's name was Rebecca, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca Thorne. Ethan's breath fogged the glass. He'd never known his mother's maiden name. His father had spoken of her only in fragments, broken pieces of memory that never formed a complete picture. She was our sister, Maya added, and Ethan felt the world tilt beneath his feet. He turned slowly, studying their faces in the lamplight. Now that he looked, really looked, he could see it. The shape of the eyes that stared back at him from mirrors, the stubborn set of the jaw he'd inherited, the way their hands moved when they spoke. It was like seeing ghosts of himself in their features. That's impossible, he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't. My father never mentioned. Your father took you away when you were barely 2 years old, Clara interrupted, her voice sharp with old pain. In the middle of the night, like a thief. Rebecca had been dead less than a month. Maya's hands trembled as she opened an old leather album. We tried to find you. For years we searched. But Silas, your father, he was good at disappearing when he wanted to. The photographs Maya showed him were like puzzle pieces clicking into place. A young woman with his dark hair and serious expression holding a baby, him, outside this very cabin. Another of the same woman with 2 other girls who could only be Maya and Clara, decades younger but unmistakably themselves. Why didn't he tell me? Ethan's voice cracked like a teenager's. Why didn't I know I had family? Because Silas blamed us for Rebecca's death, Clara said, settling heavily into her chair. And maybe he was right too. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken guilt. Outside, a branch creaked in the wind, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried. Maya closed the album carefully. Our sister was troubled. She'd always been the wildest of us 3, the one who couldn't sit still, couldn't accept the quiet life we'd chosen. When she met your father, it was like watching fire meet gasoline. She loved him desperately, Clara continued. But Silas was already married then to a woman in the valley. Rebecca knew it, but she couldn't let go. When she found out she was carrying you, she thought it would change everything. Ethan sank into the remaining chair, his legs suddenly unable to support him. It didn't. Silas promised to leave his wife, to make a life with Rebecca and you, but months passed, then a year his wife was sick, he said. He couldn't abandon her. Rebecca grew more desperate, more unstable. She'd disappear for days, leaving you with us, then return wild-eyed and talking about forcing Silas to choose. What happened to her? Ethan asked, though part of him feared the answer. Maya and Clara exchanged a look that spoke of shared nightmares, of a guilt that had eaten at them for 16 years. She went to confront him one last time, Maya whispered. It was winter, like this. The roads were icy. She took our father's old truck, the one with bad brakes. We should have stopped her. We knew she was in no state to drive. The truck went off Devil's Bend, Clara finished, 2 miles down the mountain. By the time they found her, it was too late. Ethan felt tears he hadn't expected burning his eyes. And my father blamed you. He said we'd enabled her obsession, that we should have done more to keep her away from him. Maybe he was right. We'd watched her destroying herself and done nothing. Maya's voice was thick with regret, so he took me away. In the dead of night, without a word. We woke up, and you were gone. Our lawyer said he had paternal rights, that without proof of neglect, there was nothing we could do. Clara reached across the small space between them and touched Ethan's hand. We never stopped loving you, never stopped hoping you'd find your way back to us. When we saw you at our door, half-frozen and desperate. She couldn't finish the sentence. Ethan stared at their joined hands, his own rough and calloused from years of hard living, hers soft but strong, marked with age but gentle, as he remembered from dreams he'd thought were imagination. I have aunts, he said wonderfully, and both women smiled through their tears. You have a family, Maya corrected. You've always had a family. Now you know where to find us. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke just after sunset, sending sheets of rain against the cabin windows. Ezra sat by the fire, turning the brass compass over in his hands for what felt like the 100th time. The metal was warm from his touch, but the secrets it held remained cold and distant. "You're going to wear the engraving smooth," Iris observed from her chair near the window, where she'd been watching the lightning illuminate the valley below. "Tell me about the day you found this," Ezra said, not looking up from the compass. "Everything you remember." Iris exchanged a glance with Violet, who had been unusually quiet since their discovery in the hidden room. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackling fire and the steady drum of rain on the roof. "We were 12, Violet finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was the first time we'd ventured beyond the meadow since our parents died. We weren't supposed to leave the property," Iris added, "but we heard voices in the woods, men calling out. We thought maybe someone was lost." Ezra's grip tightened on the compass. "What kind of voices?" "Desperate ones," Violet said, "like they were searching for something precious they'd lost." The twins' eyes met across the room, and Ezra caught the weight of unspoken memory passing between them. He'd grown accustomed to their silent communications over the past weeks, but this felt different, heavier somehow. "We followed the voices to the old logging trail," Iris continued, "the one that runs along Eagle Creek. There were 3 men there, all of them torn up and bleeding. One had a broken arm. They didn't see us at first," Violet said. "We hid behind the fallen oak. You know the one, where the lightning struck years ago. They were arguing about which way to go, whether to keep following the creek or head up toward the ridge." Ezra leaned forward. "Did you recognize any of them?" "One of them," Iris said slowly. "He had the same eyes as you." The compass slipped from Ezra's fingers and clattered to the floor. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence, mixing with the storm outside. He bent to retrieve it, his hands shaking slightly. "My father?" "We thought so," Violet said, "though we'd only seen him a few times before, when he'd come to trade with our parents. He was younger then, before whatever trouble found him." "What happened next?" "They heard us," Iris said. A branch snapped under Violet's foot, and suddenly they all turned toward our hiding spot. "The man with your eyes, he looked terrified when he saw us." "Not of us," Violet clarified quickly. "For us, like our being there put us in danger." "He ran toward us, limping badly," Iris continued. "That's when we saw the blood on his shirt, the way he favored his left side. He kept looking over his shoulder like something was chasing them." Ezra's mind raced. This matched fragments of memories he'd buried deep. His father returning home injured, the hushed conversations with his mother, the way they'd suddenly packed up and moved deeper into the mountains. "He pressed something into my hand," Violet said, her voice growing even quieter. "Told me to keep it safe, that someday someone might come looking for it, someone who belonged to it." "The compass," Ezra breathed. "He said if anything happened to him, we should give it to his boy when he was old enough to understand, that it would lead him home when he was ready." Thunder crashed overhead, making them all jump. In the flickering firelight, the twins looked younger somehow, as if telling the story had transported them back to that frightening day in the woods. "Did he say anything else?" Ezra asked. "He told us his name," Iris said. "Marcus Thorne. And he said if his son ever came looking for him, we should tell him that the truth wasn't buried with the past. It was hidden where the old maps marked the 10th. Ezra stared at the compass in his palm, his father's name echoing in his mind. Marcus Thorne. He'd grown up knowing only fragments of that name, whispered in his mother's prayers, carved into a crude wooden cross that marked what he'd believed was his father's grave. "Where did they go after that?" he asked. "Back toward the creek," Violet said. "But we heard gunshots later that night. By morning there was no sign of any of them." "That's when we found this," Iris said, pulling something from her pocket. It was a piece of torn fabric, weathered and faded, but still bearing the distinctive pattern Ezra recognized from his earliest memories, the same blue and green plaid his father had worn on cold mornings. "We saved it," Violet said simply, "hoping someday we'd be able to return it to family." Ezra reached for the fabric with trembling fingers, and as he touched it, the compass in his other hand seemed to grow warm, its needle spinning wildly before settling on a direction that led deeper into the mountains than he'd ever dared to venture. The morning light filtering through the cabin windows seemed different somehow, charged with possibility and dread in equal measure. Elias sat at the worn wooden table, his fingers tracing the edges of the photograph Clara had given him the night before, the image of his father as a young man standing beside a woman who wasn't his mother had shattered something fundamental in his understanding of himself. Maya emerged from the kitchen carrying a steaming mug of coffee, her movements careful and deliberate. The tension between the sisters had been palpable since Clara's revelation, though neither had spoken of it directly. She set the mug before Elias without meeting his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly, studying her face for any resemblance to the woman in the photograph. Now that he was looking for it, he could see subtle similarities. The shape of her nose, the way her eyebrows arched when she was thinking. Clara appeared in the doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour. "We need to show you the rest," she announced, her voice carrying a weight that made Elias's stomach clench. "The letters, the documents, everything your father left behind." Maya's coffee cup rattled against its saucer. "Clara, we agreed to tell him the truth. That's what I'm doing." Clara's green eyes flashed with determination. "He deserves to know why his father came here, why he kept coming back, and why he made us promise to watch over his son." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. "He made you promise to watch over me?" The sisters exchanged a loaded glance. It was Maya who finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "When you showed up at our door 3 days ago, it wasn't chance, Elias. We've been waiting for you." The cabin suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. Elias pushed back from the table, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. "What do you mean, waiting for me?" Clara disappeared into what Elias had assumed was a storage closet, returning with a wooden box that looked as old as the cabin itself. She set it on the table with reverence, as if it contained something sacred or dangerous. "Your father came to us first when you were 12, she began, lifting the lid to reveal stacks of letters tied with faded ribbon. "He was desperate, afraid. He'd discovered something about your mother's death, something that made him believe you might be in danger." Elias felt the ground shifting beneath him again. "My mother died in a car accident." "That's what everyone was supposed to believe," Maya said softly. "But your father found evidence that suggested otherwise. Medical records that didn't match the official story. Witness accounts that had been suppressed. Someone had gone to great lengths to cover up the real circumstances of her death." Clara pulled out a manila envelope, yellowed with age. "He brought us everything he'd found, made us promise that if anything happened to him, if you ever needed refuge, we would tell you the truth he'd been too afraid to share." The photographs spilled across the table as Clara opened the envelope. Crime scene photos, medical documents, newspaper clippings that painted a picture far different from the one Elias had carried his entire life. His mother's car, wrapped around a tree, but with damage patterns that didn't match a simple accident. A coroner's report with suspicious annotations in the margins. A witness statement describing another vehicle leaving the scene. "She was murdered," Elias said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "Your father believed so," Clara confirmed, "and he thought whoever killed her might eventually come for you too." The room spun slightly as Elias gripped the edge of the table. "Why? What could I possibly know? I was only 8 when she died." Maya reached across and touched his hand gently. "It might not be about what you know now, but what you might discover as you got older. Your mother was investigating something before she died, something involving land rights, mineral claims in these mountains. Your father found her notes." Clara produced another set of documents, these covered in his mother's careful handwriting. Maps of the surrounding area with X marks and question marks scattered across the terrain. Lists of names, some crossed out, others circled in red ink. At the bottom of one page, written in capital letters, were the words, "They're hiding something big." "Your father spent 15 years trying to piece together what she'd found," Clara continued. "Every few months he'd come here with new information, new theories. He was getting close to something when he died, Elias finished, understanding flooding through him like ice water. His accident wasn't an accident either, was it? The silence that followed was answer enough. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending shadows dancing across the walls. Somewhere in the distance, Elias could swear he heard the sound of an engine, growing steadily closer. Maya's head snapped toward the window, her face pale. "Clara," she whispered urgently, "someone's coming." The fire crackled between them as Elara spread the yellow documents across the wooden table. Marcus leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs as he tried to make sense of the faded handwriting. Birth certificates, property deeds, and letters tied with brittle ribbon. Pieces of a puzzle he'd never known existed. "Your mother's name was Catherine," Elara said softly, her finger tracing a line on one of the documents. "Catherine Blackwood. She was our younger sister." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He stared at the birth certificate bearing his mother's name, the date placing her 3 years younger than the twins. "Sister?" he whispered. "But my father said—" "Your father said what he needed to say to keep you safe," Lydia interrupted, settling into the chair beside her twin. "But the time for those lies has passed." Marcus studied their faces in the firelight, searching for traces of resemblance he'd been too blind to see. The shape of Lydia's eyes, the curve of Elara's mouth. Features that echoed in his own reflection, features he'd inherited from a mother he'd barely remembered. "She was supposed to come with us," Elara continued, her voice thick with old grief. "When we fled the valley, Catherine was meant to follow. But she'd fallen in love with your father, and love made her believe she could stay hidden." "Hidden from what?" Marcus asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. The twins exchanged a look heavy with decades of shared burden. Lydia reached for a leather journal, its covers worn smooth by countless hands. "Our family has protected something for generations, a secret that powerful people would kill for." She opened the journal, revealing pages covered in symbols and diagrams that seemed to shift in the dancing light. Marcus recognized some of the markings. He'd seen them carved into rocks throughout these mountains, dismissed them as old Native American petroglyphs. "The mountain doesn't just hide veins of silver and gold," Lydia said. "There's something else buried deep in its heart, something our great-grandfather discovered when he first settled here." "A chamber," Elara added, her eyes distant. "Carved from living rock, filled with artifacts that predate any known civilization in these parts. Our family became its guardians, passing down the responsibility through generations." Marcus felt the world tilting around him. "That's why the mining company wants the land so badly. They know." "Some of them suspect," Lydia confirmed, "but knowledge of the chamber has been carefully contained, until 15 years ago when someone we trusted betrayed that trust." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Marcus watched them dance and disappear, understanding beginning to dawn like a cold sunrise. "The night my mother died. That wasn't an accident." Elara's hand found his across the table, her fingers warm and steady. "Catherine tried to warn us that they were coming. She managed to get word to your father, told him to take you and run. She was going to destroy what records she could and follow, but they got to her first." Marcus's voice was barely audible. The cabin fire, the one that had taken his mother when he was 7 years old, suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. "She died protecting the secret." "She died protecting you," Lydia said firmly. "If they'd found you that night, if they'd realized Catherine had a son who might know the location of the chamber, you wouldn't have lived to see another dawn." Marcus pulled his hands free, running them through his hair as he tried to process everything. His entire life had been built on half-truths and careful omissions. His father's paranoia, their constant moving, the way they'd always avoided staying too long in any one place. It all made terrible sense now. "Where is it?" he asked finally. "This chamber you've been protecting." The twins were quiet for a long moment. Then Elara rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the moonlit peaks. "Your mother was the only one who knew the exact location. Our father shared it with her before he died, but we were away at school. By the time we returned, he was gone, and Catherine had shouldered the burden alone. She never told you? She never had the chance, Lydia said sadly. We thought we had time. Catherine was young, healthy. We assumed she'd eventually share the knowledge with us, or at least leave some record. But when she died so suddenly, Marcus felt the weight of revelation settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. So the secret died with her. Maybe, Elara said, turning back from the window, or maybe she found a way to pass it on. Catherine was clever, always thinking 3 steps ahead. If she left any clues, any way to find the chamber, she would have hidden them somewhere safe. In the flickering firelight, Marcus saw hope kindle in his aunt's eyes, hope mixed with something that looked almost like relief. After 15 years of carrying this burden alone, they were no longer the only guardians of a secret that had already cost them everything. The photograph trembled in Ezra's hands as the lamplight danced across its faded surface. 3 figures stood frozen in time, a man with Ezra's own dark eyes and angular jaw, flanked by 2 women who bore an unmistakable resemblance to Mira and Thea. But it was the infant cradled in the man's arms that made Ezra's breath catch in his throat. "That's my father," Thea whispered, her finger hovering over the man's face. "Thomas Blackwood. And that baby—" She looked up at Ezra with eyes glistening with unshed tears. "That's you!" Mira shifted beside them, her usual composure cracking. "We've carried this secret for 17 years, waiting for the day you'd find your way back to us." Ezra's legs gave out, and he sank into the nearest chair. The photograph fluttered to the floor as he buried his face in his hands. "This can't be real. The McCready family took me in when I was abandoned. They told me my parents were dead, that no one wanted me." "The McCrearys lied to you," Mira said, her voice sharp with old anger. "They stole you from us." The room spun around Ezra as fragments of memories began shifting into new patterns. The way Josiah McCready always looked at him with something between resentment and fear. The hushed conversations that stopped whenever he entered a room. The constant reminders that he should be grateful for their charity. "Tell me everything," he managed to say through the tightness in his throat. Thea retrieved the photograph, cradling it like something sacred. "Our father was a botanist, a brilliant man who discovered something in these mountains that others wanted to possess. He found a rare species of plant that could treat illnesses thought incurable. But knowledge like that attracts dangerous attention. Corporate interests from the city," Mira continued. "Men who saw profit where our father saw healing. They made offers he refused, then threats he ignored. When those failed," she trailed off, her jaw clenching. "They killed him," Thea finished. "Made it look like an accident, a fall from the ridge while collecting specimens, but we knew better. We were only 14, twins ourselves, but we understood we were next." Ezra looked up at them, seeing not just the women who had sheltered him, but family, blood relatives who had been torn from him by greed and violence. "What about me? Why didn't they kill me too?" "You were so small, barely walking," Mira explained. "We think they planned to use you as leverage against us, to force us to reveal the location of Father's research. But we went into hiding first, deep in the forest where even the old-timers feared to venture. Josiah McCready was working with them," Thea added, her voice thick with disgust. "He was supposed to watch you temporarily, but when we disappeared completely, he claimed you as his own ward. Built his reputation as a charitable man while pocketing the money they paid him." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Ezra remembered the visitors who occasionally came to the McCready farm, well-dressed men who spoke in low voices and always left Josiah nervous and jumpy. He remembered being hidden in the root cellar during some of those visits, told it was a game when it felt more like imprisonment. "We watched from afar," Mira said softly. "Every birthday, every milestone. We saw how they treated you, like a burden rather than the gift you truly are, but we couldn't risk exposing ourselves while those men still hunted us." "What changed?" Ezra asked, though part of him already knew. "They're dead now," Thea said simply. The last of them died this past winter. Corporate scandals and old age claimed them all. We've been free to reclaim our lives, our home. She gestured around the cabin. This was our father's laboratory. We've spent years preserving his work, continuing his research. Ezra stood on unsteady legs and walked to the window, staring out at the moonlit forest that had seemed so foreign when he first arrived. Now it felt different, not alien but ancestral. These trees had sheltered his father's footsteps. These paths had known his family's presence for generations. "The storm that drove me here," he said slowly. "It wasn't just chance, was it?" Mira and Thea exchanged a look filled with secrets yet to be shared. "We may have encouraged the weather patterns somewhat," Mira admitted. "Father's research included more than just medicinal plants. The mountain itself responds to those who understand its deeper rhythms." Ezra turned back to face them, his sisters. The word felt strange and wonderful in his mind. Questions multiplied like wildflowers after rain, but underneath the confusion and anger at years lost, something else bloomed, belonging. "Show me," he said, his voice steady for the first time since entering the cabin. "Show me everything our father died protecting. Show me who I really am." The photograph trembled in Eli's hands as dawn light filtered through the cabin's frost-etched windows. His mother's face stared back at him from the faded image, younger than he'd ever seen her, standing between two girls who looked exactly like Luna and Sage. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same dark hair, the same ethereal features, the same mysterious smile that had haunted his dreams since arriving at the cabin. "She was our sister," Luna whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Our triplet." Eli's legs gave way, and he sank into the worn wooden chair beside the hearth. "That's impossible. She never mentioned. There was never any sign." Sage moved closer, her footsteps silent on the wooden floor. "Rose was the brave one. She left these mountains when we were 17, said she couldn't bear the isolation anymore. We thought we'd lost her forever. But she came back once," Luna added, settling onto the floor beside Eli's chair. 20 years ago. She was pregnant, frightened, running from something or someone. The cabin seemed to spin around Eli as fragments of his childhood suddenly rearranged themselves into a different picture. His mother's inexplicable knowledge of mountain herbs, her ability to predict storms, the way she would sometimes stare at the peaks visible from their valley home with such longing it made his chest ache. "She stayed here for 3 months, Sage continued, her fingers tracing patterns on the dusty mantelpiece. "Refused to tell us who the father was, just kept saying it was too dangerous, that he could never know. When you were born, she held you like you were made of starlight." Eli clutched the photograph tighter, studying the 3 identical faces. "Why didn't she stay? Why take me away?" Luna and Sage exchanged one of their wordless conversations, years of shared thoughts passing between them in a single glance. Finally, Luna spoke. "Because of what we are," she said simply. "What Rose was. What you might be. I don't understand." Sage knelt beside his chair, her pale eyes reflecting the firelight. "Our family line carries something ancient, Eli. A gift passed down through generations. The ability to sense things others cannot. To know the mountain's moods. To feel the emotions of others. To sometimes glimpse what's to come. Your mother was the strongest of us 3, Luna added softly. Her visions were vivid, powerful, too powerful sometimes. She saw something the night before she left, something that terrified her enough to take you and disappear." Eli remembered the strange sensations he'd experienced since arriving at the cabin, the way he'd known exactly where to find the hidden path, how he'd felt the twins' emotions as if they were his own, the dreams that felt more like memories. "She never told me any of this." "She was protecting you," Sage said, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Living among ordinary people, raising you away from these mountains, it was her way of keeping you safe from whatever she saw in that vision." "But she's gone now," Luna whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "And you came to us just as the old bloodline magic grows stronger. It's not coincidence, Eli. It's destiny calling you home." Outside, the wind howled through the pine trees, carrying with it the scent of approaching snow and something else, something that made the hair on Eli's neck stand on end. Luna and Sage both stiffened, their heads turning toward the windows in perfect unison. "He's coming," Luna breathed, her face pale as moonlight. "Who's coming?" Eli demanded, rising from his chair as adrenaline flooded his system. Sage moved to the window, peering through the frosted glass. "The one your mother was running from. We can feel him on the mountain, getting closer." "That's impossible. No one knows I'm here." "He doesn't need to know," Luna said, her voice urgent now. "He can sense the awakening of your gifts, just as we did. The magic in your blood is calling to him." Eli felt something shift inside him, like a door opening in his mind. Suddenly, he could sense it too, a dark presence moving up the mountain trails, filled with hunger and malice. His mother's warnings echoed in his memory, fragmented phrases he'd never understood. "Never trust those who seek power over others, and your father's blood carries both blessing and curse." "My father," he said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "He's my father, isn't he?" The twins nodded grimly. "A man who collects those with gifts like ours," Sage explained, "uses them, controls them. Your mother escaped his influence once, but now he's found me." Eli looked between the sisters, seeing his own fear reflected in their faces. "What do we do?" Luna rose gracefully, moving toward a wooden chest in the corner. "We prepare you for what's coming. The gifts that have been sleeping in your blood, it's time to wake them up." The wind outside grew stronger, carrying with it the promise of an approaching storm and something far more dangerous. The old photograph trembled in Ethan's hands as he stared at the face that could have been his own reflection. Standing beside a younger version of Margareta was a man with his eyes, his jawline, his unruly dark hair that never quite lay flat. The stranger wore the clothes of another era, but the resemblance was unmistakable. "Your father," Cordelia said softly, her voice carrying decades of carefully guarded pain. "Thomas Blackwood." Margareta moved closer, her fingers ghosting over the glass surface of the frame. "He came to us much like you did, Ethan, desperate, running from something he couldn't name. But unlike you, he never found what he was looking for." The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing inward as Ethan struggled to process what he was seeing. "My father died when I was 3. My mother told me—" "Your mother told you what she needed to tell you," Cordelia interrupted gently, "what she believed would keep you safe." Ethan's mind raced, connecting fragments that had never made sense before. His mother's reluctance to speak of his father, the way she'd flinch whenever he asked questions, the sudden moves they'd made throughout his childhood. Always running, always hiding, but from what? "There's more," Margareta said, moving toward an ornate wooden chest that sat beneath the window. The morning light caught the dust motes dancing above it as she lifted the heavy lid. From within, she withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Thomas kept a record of his time here, of what he discovered about himself, about his family. She held the journal out to Ethan, about the Blackwood legacy. With shaking hands, Ethan accepted the journal. The leather was soft and worn, warmed by countless fingers that had traced its edges. He opened it carefully, and his father's handwriting greeted him like a voice from the grave. "Day 127 at the cabin. The dreams are getting stronger. I see things that haven't happened yet, know things I shouldn't know. Margareta says it runs in families, this gift that feels more like a curse. She's trying to help me understand, but how do you understand something that defies every law of nature?" "Gift?" Ethan looked up, confusion evident in his voice. Cordelia settled into the chair across from him, her ancient hands folded in her lap. "The Blackwood family has always been different, sensitive to things others cannot perceive. Your father could see glimpses of the future, sense danger before it arrived. It's why he was running when he found us." "And it's why you came to us," Margareta added, returning to her sister's side. The same instinct that guided your father through the storm brought you here. You felt it, didn't you? The pull toward this place? Ethan's breath caught. He had felt it. That inexplicable certainty that this cabin held answers he desperately needed. The way his dreams had grown more vivid, more prophetic, the closer he'd gotten to the mountains. The strange knowing that had settled in his bones the moment he'd stepped through their door. He turned the page, his father's words drawing him deeper into a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The sisters tell me there are others like us scattered throughout these mountains, families who've guarded the old secrets for generations. They speak of responsibilities, of purposes greater than ourselves. But all I want is to go home to Sarah and my son. All I want is a normal life. What happened to him? Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. The twins exchanged a look heavy with sorrow. Margareta spoke first. He tried to return to your mother, to pretend he could live an ordinary life. But the gift, it demanded acknowledgement. The visions became overwhelming, the weight of unspoken warnings too much to bear. He died trying to save someone, Cordelia continued. A vision showed him a coming disaster at the mining company where he'd found work. He tried to warn them, tried to evacuate the workers, but no one believed him until it was too late. Ethan closed his eyes, seeing his father clearly for the first time, not the absent figure his mother had painted, but a man torn between love and duty, between the desire for normalcy and the burden of extraordinary ability. The mine collapse, he said suddenly, remembering stories from his childhood. It happened 3 years after I was born. 27 men died. 27 men were saved, Margareta corrected. Because your father refused to stay silent, he died getting the last group to safety. The journal fell open to the final entry, and Ethan read words that felt like a benediction. If something happens to me, if I never see my son grow up, I hope someday he'll understand. The gift isn't a burden, it's a calling, and maybe, if he's lucky, he'll find his way to the twins who helped me understand that running from who you are only delays the inevitable. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and Ethan felt the familiar electric tension that preceded his visions. But for the first time in his life, he didn't fight it. The letter trembled in Ezra's hands as dawn light filtered through the cabin windows. His father's handwriting, unmistakable despite the years, revealed truths that rewrote everything he thought he knew about his life. Behind him, Clara and Rose sat in respectful silence, their weathered faces etched with the weight of secrets finally released. Your mother didn't abandon you, the letter continued in his father's familiar script. She died protecting you from those who would have taken you from us. The twins, Clara and Rose Whitmore, are her sisters, your aunts. They've watched over you from afar all these years, as I promised Margaret they would. Ezra's breath caught. Margaret. His mother's name was Margaret Whitmore, not the faceless woman of his imaginings, but someone with sisters who loved her enough to honor a deathbed promise. I told you she left because I couldn't bear to see the blame in your eyes, the letter went on. But the blame was mine alone. I brought danger to our door through my involvement with men who dealt in stolen goods and worse. When they came for what they believed I owed them, your mother stood between them and our home. Between them and you. Rose's voice broke the silence, soft as morning mist. Margaret was the strongest of us three. Even as children, she was the one who faced down bullies, who stood up to our father when his drinking turned mean. When she met your father, we thought his gentle nature would calm her fire. Instead, it made her fiercer. Clara reached across the space between them and touched Ezra's shoulder. She loved him desperately, but she loved you more. When those men came, her voice faltered. Ezra looked up from the letter, seeing these women, his aunts, with new eyes. The way they'd welcomed him that first desperate night, the food that appeared when he was hungry, the careful distance that never felt like rejection. They'd been honoring a promise, protecting him while respecting his father's wishes. Why didn't he tell me? The words came out broken, raw with years of accumulated pain. Read on, Rose whispered. His father's letter continued with explanations that felt like bandages on old wounds. How he'd moved them deeper into the mountains, how he'd sworn the twins to secrecy, how he'd convinced himself that Ezra was safer believing his mother had chosen to leave rather than knowing she'd died violently. "I thought I was protecting you from the truth," his father had written, "but I see now that I was protecting myself from your grief, from having to relive that terrible night every time you asked about her. Clara and Rose begged me to let them help raise you, but my pride wouldn't allow it. My shame ran too deep." The letter went on to describe how his father had struggled with guilt and isolation, how he'd watched Ezra grow up hungry for stories about a mother he'd never really known, how he died with regret heavy in his heart, but not before writing this confession and giving it to the twins, with instructions to share it only when Ezra was ready. "There's more," Clara said gently, producing a small wooden box from behind her chair. "Things that belong to your mother. We've kept them all these years." Inside the box lay treasures that spoke of a life cut short. A silver locket with a photograph of a young woman who shared Ezra's dark eyes and stubborn chin. Letters written in a flowing hand that spoke of dreams and hopes. A pair of worn gloves that still smelled faintly of lavender. At the bottom of the box lay another photograph, this one of 3 young women standing arm in arm outside the very cabin where they now sat. Margaret stood in the middle, her face bright with laughter, flanked by younger versions of Clara and Rose. "She was 26 when she died," Rose said, her voice thick with remembered grief. "You were barely 3. For weeks after, you kept asking when she was coming home. Your father couldn't bear it. That's when he told you she'd gone away." Ezra traced his mother's face in the photograph, trying to reconcile this vibrant woman with the hollow absence that had shaped his childhood. What happened to the men who killed her? "Justice found them eventually," Clara replied, her tone suggesting that justice had perhaps been helped along by mountain folk who didn't take kindly to those who harmed their own. The silence that followed felt different from the heavy quiet of secrets kept. This was the silence of truth acknowledged, of wounds finally exposed to healing light. Ezra looked at his aunts. The word felt strange but right in his mind, and saw not the eccentric hermits he'd first imagined, but women who'd honored love and duty for 17 years. "Will you tell me about her?" he asked finally. "Everything. I want to know everything." Clara and Rose exchanged a look filled with relief and something that might have been joy. "We have 17 years of stories to share," Rose said, settling back in her chair, "and all the time in the world to tell them." The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke as Elias sat before the dying fire, the journal trembling in his hands. Rain lashed against the cabin windows with a fury that seemed to mirror the chaos in his mind. Everything he thought he knew about himself, about his family, about the past 23 years of his life, lay shattered around him like broken glass. "Your mother never died in that avalanche," Vera said quietly from her chair across the room. "She survived. Barely, but she survived." Mira moved closer, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "We found her 3 days after the slide, half frozen, delirious with fever and grief. She thought she'd lost everyone. Your father, you, the life she'd built in the valley below." Elias looked up from the journal pages filled with his mother's handwriting, her words of love and loss, her desperate hope that someday she might find her son again. "But why didn't she come back for me? Why did everyone tell me she was dead?" The twins exchanged a glance heavy with years of shared secrets. It was Vera who finally spoke, because by the time she was strong enough to make the journey down the mountain, you were gone. Your father's brother had already taken you away, told the whole valley that he was your only remaining family. "Uncle Thomas," Elias whispered, remembering the harsh man who had raised him with duty but never love, who had forbidden any talk of the past, who had moved them far from the mountains when Elias was still small. "He convinced everyone it would be kinder to let you believe she was dead," Mira continued. "Said it would help you heal, help you move on. But your mother, Sarah, she never stopped looking for you. She lived with us for 15 years, Elias, 15 years of hoping and searching and grieving, The fire popped and hissed, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls. Elias felt as though he were drowning in the weight of lost time, lost love, lost possibilities. Where is she now? Vera's eyes filled with tears. She died 2 winters ago. Her heart just gave out, but not before she made us promise something. Elias couldn't breathe. He had come so close, had been searching in these very mountains while she was still alive, still hoping. The cruel irony of it cut deeper than any physical wound he had ever endured. What promise? He managed to ask. Mira reached into the wooden chest beside her chair and withdrew something wrapped in faded blue cloth. She made us promise that if you ever came looking, if you ever found your way back to these mountains, we would give you this. She unwrapped the cloth carefully, revealing a small wooden carving of a hawk in flight, its wings spread wide against an invisible wind. Elias recognized it immediately. He had dreamed of it countless times, though he had never understood why. She carved this for you on your 5th birthday, Vera explained. You carried it everywhere until the avalanche. She found it in the debris when she was looking for survivors, clutched it to her chest like a talisman. Elias took the carving with shaking hands, feeling the smooth wood worn soft by years of loving touch. His mother had held this, had poured her grief and love into preserving this small piece of their shared past. She used to sit by the window every evening, Mira said softly, watching the path that led down the mountain. She always believed you would come home. I should have come sooner, Elias said, his voice breaking. I should have kept searching, should have trusted my instincts about these mountains. You came when you were meant to come, Vera replied. Sarah always said the mountains would call you back when the time was right. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease, though rain still drummed steadily against the roof. Elias held the carved hawk up to the firelight, seeing in its simple lines all the love and hope his mother had carried for him through 15 long years of separation. There's something else, Mira said hesitantly. Sarah left you a letter, her final words to you. Elias looked up sharply, hardly daring to hope. Vera rose and retrieved an envelope from the mantelpiece, yellow with age and sealed with wax. She wrote this just before she died, as if she knew her time was running short. She made us swear to keep it safe. With trembling fingers, Elias broke the seal and unfolded the letter. His mother's familiar handwriting swam before his eyes as he read her final message, words of love and forgiveness, of pride in the man she believed he had become, of her unshakable faith that love transcends even death itself. And there, in the closing lines, she revealed one last secret that would change everything he thought he knew about his future. The morning sun cast long shadows through the cabin windows as Ethan sat at the worn wooden table, the leather-bound journal open before him. His fingers traced the faded ink of his mother's handwriting, each word a revelation that had shattered everything he thought he knew about his life. She wrote this the night before she left you, Maya said softly, settling into the chair beside him. She knew she might never see you again. Across the room, Luna stood by the fireplace, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Our father thought it was too dangerous for her to stay. The mining company was closing in, and they would have used her, used you, to force him to sign over the mineral rights. Ethan's throat tightened as he read his mother's words. My precious boy, if you're reading this, then you've found your way home to your aunts. I pray they can give you the love I was too afraid to provide. The mountain calls to our blood, and now you'll understand why you could never settle in the valley below. All these years, Ethan whispered, I thought she abandoned me because I wasn't enough, because something was wrong with me. Maya reached out and covered his hand with hers. She left you with the Hendersons because she loved you. She knew that, if the mining company discovered you existed, they'd never stop hunting our family. The journal's pages rustled as Luna approached, her movements careful and deliberate. But you found us anyway. The mountain brought you home when the time was right. Ethan looked up at the 2 women who had become his anchors in this storm of revelation. Their faces, so similar yet distinct, bore the same high cheekbones and deep-set eyes he recognized from looking in mirrors his entire life. Family. Real family. What happened to her? The question had burned in his chest since Maya first spoke their mother's name. The twins exchanged a glance, and Luna's voice grew heavy. She died 3 years ago. Pneumonia. She never stopped hoping you'd find your way to us. The grief hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, to have come so close to finding her, only to learn he was too late. Maya's arm slipped around his shoulders, and he found himself leaning into her warmth, grateful for the contact. "She left something else for you," Luna said, disappearing into the back room. She returned with a small wooden box, its surface carved with intricate mountain scenes. She made this herself. Inside the box, nestled in faded blue cloth, was a silver pendant shaped like a soaring hawk. The metalwork was exquisite, clearly handcrafted with infinite care, but it was the photograph beneath it that made Ethan's heart stop, a young woman with wild dark hair and laughing eyes, holding a baby against a backdrop of snow-capped peaks. "That was taken the day before she had to leave," Maya said. "Look at how she's looking at you. That's not the face of a woman who didn't want her child." Ethan lifted the pendant, feeling its weight in his palm. The silver was warm, as if it had been waiting for his touch. Around the hawk's base, tiny words were engraved, "Soar high, my son." "There's more," Luna said gently. "The mining company never found what they were looking for. The surveys were wrong. But our father's will left the entire mountain to his children, all 3 of them. 3? Ethan's head snapped up. "You, Ethan, you're an heir too. Your mother never signed away her rights, which means they pass to you." Maya's smile was radiant. "The mountain is yours as much as ours." The implications crashed over him in waves, not just family but belonging, a place where the restlessness that had driven him his entire life could finally find peace. He thought of the valley below, of Sarah Henderson's kitchen, and the life he'd been trying to force himself to want. "I don't know if I can stay," he said finally, honesty compelling him to voice his fears. "I've never belonged anywhere. I don't know how." Luna knelt beside his chair, her pale eyes intense. "We've been alone up here for so long, we'd forgotten what it meant to be a family. You reminded us. Maybe we can all learn together." Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the pines with a sound like music. Ethan closed his eyes and listened, really listened, to the voice he'd been hearing his entire life. It wasn't calling him away this time, it was welcoming him home. He fastened the silver hawk around his neck and felt something inside his chest settle into place, like a key turning in a long-locked door. Whatever came next, he wasn't facing it alone. For the first time in his life, he was exactly where he belonged.